we had to either lay somebody off because I couldn't make payroll anymore for the full team. And at the same time, we had a potential client come to us. But the difficulty was that this is a company that completely against all of our values, did not have a very good reputation as an employer. And it's funny, I don't think I thought of it at the time as being, a quote unquote pitch, but it was really more of a, hey, let's all band together. Let's collaborate. Let's figure out, how do we get through this? What are some things that we can do?
Hey there, Pitches. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Pitched. I am your host, Angie Trueblood. I'm a podcast guesting and hosting expert and the founder of the Podwize Group, a concierge podcast interview booking agency. If you are an OG listener of the podcast, welcome back, my friend, and thank you for your support over the years. Today's episode is a fun one, I promise. I have a conversation with Ken Schmitt, who is a current client of ours, and he shares his experience, quote, pitching his team two not so great options to pull themselves out of a rough patch of business. But before we dig in, it is time for our podcast love of the week. This week's podcast is the show that our guest Ken hosts. Now, recently, he and his team actually rebranded their podcast and refocused it and changed the content up a bit. Shocking, I know, since I just went through this as well. I think you're actually going to love his show. The new title of it is Leadership Happens. And each week, Ken hosts conversations with exceptional leaders as they speak openly about the good and bad choices that have shaped their journey and how they managed to retain their humanity along the way. I especially love the segments that he hosts in the beginning of the episodes. They are the do-over and do-again segments where the guests actually share what they have struggled with and then what some of their biggest learnings are. So, hop on over and follow Leadership Happens, a little play on words, if you will. Do that now so that after you learn more about Ken and get to know him through this interview, you can listen to his most recent episode. So, who is this guy, Ken, that I'm chatting with today? Well, he is the founder and CEO of TurningPoint Executive Search, and it's a firm that offers boutique recruiting services for companies that are hiring C-suite level executives. He's also the author of the Practical Optimist book, An Entrepreneurial Journey Through Life's Turning Points, and he hosts, as I mentioned, the Leadership Happens podcast. Now, we started working with Ken and his team several months ago, and one of the things that stood out to me immediately was how committed he was to preserving his own and his brand's reputation by being really clear on the types of shows and hosts that he wanted to connect with. I always applaud clients and colleagues when they recognize early on the importance of who we partner with when it comes to being interviewed on someone else's show or inviting them to be a guest on ours. We've recorded episodes about this in the past, but you really are kind of advocating for whomever that host is when you guest on their show and vice versa. And it's important to do your homework before you do that. In Ken's case, we do the homework on his behalf, but I always love it during our initial calls when clients ask questions about how will you figure out if the hosts are aligned with our values. So Ken is such a good guy in tackling that up front. Now, during the interview, what I want you to pay close attention to is the really impossible situation that Ken was in with regard to his business and his team, and how his level of transparency and vulnerability really helped the team create a solution that he wasn't expecting. And I think you'll see throughout the conversation the impact that this can have when we are pitching ourselves or anything really. So without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Ken Schmitt. All right, Ken, I am so excited to hear your pitch story. I want you to set it up for us a little bit. What was going on in work, in the world, in your space to where you felt like you needed to pitch this something? Set the context for us, if you will.
Sure. No, thank you. I appreciate being here today to talk about this. It was a pretty unique experience. And so I started my company back in 2007. And for a little bit of context, we had totally rebranded in 2011, 2012. We're an executive recruiting company. I've been doing this for quite a while, since the late 90s. But we decided to move away from accounting and finance recruiting over to sales and marketing and totally rebrand in 2011 and 2012. And so we kind of switched up our model in terms of the type of recruiting that we did. We also switched up our revenue model, our billing cycle to be more of a retained firm versus contingent. So that was all happening in 2011, 2012. Fast forward to 2015, which is when this kind of journey took place that we're going to talk about here. And things were going better in terms of the rebrand. We had finally kind of rebuilt ourselves, and people knew us as the marketing and sales and operations recruiting firm. And finally, we had finally shed that image of being the accounting and finance recruiting firm. So that branding was good. But business overall, back in that time frame, as you might remember, wasn't fantastic. And for us as a very small firm based in San Diego, at that time working primarily with companies, also with clients in San Diego, it was a bit of a challenging time, to say the least.
Okay. Was there something big happening in the world that made kind of recruiting a little bit more difficult during that time? Or was it really just kind of coming off the rebrand and getting the word out?
Yeah, it's funny. It's always hard to know for sure, right? Until you look back years and years later. It's rarely one thing. I will say that usually in the year leading up to an election, for whatever reason, the recruiting business tends to be a little bit more choppy. Right.
Okay.
Not necessarily slow the entire year, but just a little more choppy. So as we all know, 2016 was, the election. It was interesting, right? To say the least. And so that was, I think, part of it. And I think the marketplace was still, kind of uncertain about what was going to be happening in terms of coming out. As you remember, it was a very, very slow, very prolonged recovery coming out of the 07, 08, 09 crisis. It took a lot longer for the labor market to recover than it did the financial markets or other areas. So that was, I think, another component that was adding to it. And I think, honestly, just, us being a very small company at the time, we had, I think, 5 employees at that point. And like I said, we were still focused so much on just the local region as far as our market goes that we didn't have a lot of diversity in terms of our clientele.
Okay.
A little bit of micro, a little bit of macro trends that all contributed.
It's like a perfect storm sometimes.
Exactly right. The typical plight of a small business owner, right?
Yeah. I don't know if it gets easier or harder as you grow. It's just different, right? Like every step is different.
Whenever somebody asks me what's the biggest lesson I've learned over 16 years of being a business owner, I said, well, you know what? Naively, I thought by year 3, certainly by year 5, I would have, quote unquote, had it figured out. And, here we are, year 16, and I'm still trying to figure things out.
I know. I'm like, when does this get easy?
Exactly right. Yes, I agree.
But then we'd be bored. Bored.
We would, yes. Status quo was not for us.
No, not at all. Okay, so tell me then what specifically was going on in the business to where you felt like you were at this turning point, ironically, where you needed to share some of the inner workings with the team. So set that up as to what was happening to where you felt like you needed to go into a meeting with your team.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And again, a little bit more kind of backstory context. Yeah. I've always run a very transparent business. In fact, I actually have a whole chapter dedicated to this in the book that I wrote. And it's always been kind of just my personality. I grew up in a family with my dad as a Jack in the Box franchisee in the fast food space, and my mom was in real estate. And they raised me and my sister to be very, kind of very open about their businesses. The good things happen and the bad things that happen, the bad decisions that they made, the good decisions they made, challenges with employees or payroll or revenue, whatever it was. So that was kind of the way that I grew up. And so it was really kind of all that I knew, and that was my personality. So ever since I started my company in 2007, I really have run a similar kind of a transparent business. So fast forward again to 2015, and we were really struggling. And as you know, right, as a business owner, when things get difficult, The
Mhm.
last person that gets paid is the owner, which is ironic and a little bit, maybe counterintuitive. But you're taking care of your team first. Your clients and your team, come first. And I had always wanted to continue to be transparent and share with my team things that were going on, both good and bad, to get their input, their insights, and just hear things that maybe I wasn't thinking of, or kind of their creativity and hearing things through their lens versus through my own.
Yeah.
So 2015 was one of those really rough down years, and it had already been several months of us struggling and me not paying myself. And fortunately, my wife is a marriage and family therapist, and good or bad, there is always a need for that. Not very
Yeah.
cyclical, not very up and down. It's very consistent. But even with that being said, it's difficult to not be able to pay yourself for several months on end. And so at that point, I had to make a decision, right? We had to either lay somebody off because I couldn't make payroll anymore for the full team, and share with them what was going on. And at the same time, kind of the or was, at the same time, we had a potential client come to us, one that I had known for a long time, a large software company in San Diego. And they had 7 open positions they had, supposedly wanted us to work on, which for a firm our size, 7 positions from one
That's
company
huge.
is pretty substantial, right?
Yeah.
The challenge was, and kind of like, be careful what you wish for, right?
Right.
Was that, yay, the business was coming in, but the difficulty was that this is a company that did not have a very good reputation as an employer. They tended
Oh,
to
shoot.
yeah, they brought people in from outside the area. They relocate them for brand new positions, and 6-9 months later, they would eliminate that same position, and just had constant turnover and just not the best brand out there.
Mhm.
And so that led up to me having to decide, two very bad decisions or 2 bad options, right? Do I
Yeah.
lay somebody off, right? Because I can't make payroll, or do we take on this bad business that goes completely against all of our values in order to save somebody and not have to lay them off? So that
Yeah.
was the lead into this pitch that I had to provide or offer up to my team.
So, how did you prepare for that conversation? I'm assuming it was going to be in person because your team is in person in San
Yeah,
Diego, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how did you prepare? Were you nervous? Were you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, you know me at this
Yeah.
point well enough to know I'm a pretty optimistic person. I'm
Yeah.
very upbeat. It takes an awful lot to beat me down. But after several months of not paying yourself and trying to figure out, should I even still be in business? Never mind, how do I run the business? It was taking its toll for sure. And there's kind of this what I call your internal ecosystem, but also your external kind of peer ecosystem. And so I had spoken to several of my peers about this, trying to decide what to do. How do I go about it? What do you guys think? What are you up against? And there was a variety of different opinions, but that kind of at least helped me to kind of frame it a little better and to kind of hear other thoughts before I went to this conversation, with my internal team. So yes, I was nervous to say the least.
Yeah.
I did not know what to expect. I had, I think, like a lot of leaders, I had already kind of framed in my mind, okay, here are the options. This is the problem. Here are the options, right? And those options were really what I had locked into, either laying somebody off or
Mhm.
having to take on this bad business. So that was the lead into the conversation, and I gathered everybody together and jumped into the discussion.
So I want to first commend you. I mean, I know that transparency and that level of communication, it's important to your company internally. It's important with the folks that you work with to recruit for their team. So your recruiting firm, it's a human firm, right? You are, and I think that's why you and I connected so well initially, that we run businesses that at the outset could really seem like they could be transactional in nature, but we take a bit of a different spin. I think the fact that you even thought to approach your team with this rather than you just making the decision on your own as the leader speaks volumes and is very different than I think than a lot of business owners would. Did you ever get feedback when you were kind of pressure testing the idea with friends? Did they ever question you as to why are you taking this to the team? Why are you not just deciding?
Oh, all the time. Yes, exactly. And and it's funny, not that my peers or my colleagues are not transparent. They are as well to a certain extent, but I think not to the same extent that I was.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't wear my emotions on my sleeve, but at the same time, I tend to be more vulnerable. And I've always believed, and I've experienced personally, that if I'm willing to kind of put that foot forward first, right, and be the first one in an interaction with clients, employees, whatever, if I'm vulnerable first, then the odds are pretty high they're going to reciprocate.
Yep.
And it's just a really, I don't know, it sounds very simplistic and very kind of common sense, but it's that human approach, that human connection that you make first. And then that really kind of helps you build rapport when it comes to the business conversation. And so that's how I operate with my team as well. I'm close to my team. We're a small team, so it's a little easier, but I know their spouses' names and birthdays and kids' names and things that are important to them. So it's a true family. Business comes first, obviously, but it's also a true family. So I had several peers on the outside saying, Ken, why are you doing this? You're going to sound the alarm bells about how things are not going very well. Everybody's going to run for the exits and you're going to be left all alone holding the bag. Why would you do that? Just make the decision, rip off the Band-Aid, do the layoff and just move on. But it was not my style. And it would have been a very uncomfortable approach to take.
Well, and your team probably knew something was going on. Like
Sure.
They know the number of accounts they're working on compared to not. So I am of the same mindset as you. I feel like not approaching it creates more alarm because they're likely questioning what in the world is going on without any leadership. So I applaud you for that, Ken.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and they didn't know the extent of how bad things were. I hadn't at that point. I had not shared with them that I had not been paying myself.
Yeah, you weren't sending out the P&Ls every month to them.
Right. But to your point, they're astute enough to know, volume seems a little bit low. I haven't seen as much activity. Something may be percolating, kind of under the surface.
Yeah. Okay. So take us into the pitch. You're in the room with your team. It was about 4 other people or 5 other people. I'm just setting the stage. And you just kind of went for it and shared where you were, the 2 options. Anything you want to add to that? Or I'm interested to see what the team said.
Yeah, no, exactly. That was exactly what happened. And I said, here we are, right here. And it's funny. I as an aside, I do volunteering for junior achievement at the high school level. And when I go in on my once a week, sessions with them as a mentor, I use this case study as a way to have them understand what it's like to run a business. And that everything is not just, what you see online or read, in the paper or whatever. There are a lot of difficult decisions you have to make. So I use this scenario quite a bit. But yeah, so I said to the team, this, and I said, you all know me well enough to know that I'm transparent. Here's what's going on. We have 2 really difficult options. We can't make payroll right now. And I said, and that's when I disclosed that I hadn't been paying myself for a few months and had been surviving on my wife's salary and obviously our
She was getting tired of that.
Exactly. Right. Luckily, as a therapist, she's very even keeled, but everything takes a toll eventually. And I said, so we have this situation where we can't make payroll. And I had an okay pipeline of business that may be coming through, but it wasn't going to be right away. It was probably several months down the road. And I said, however, we have this opportunity through this client. I won't mention the client's name, but this client, and there's 7 roles they want us to hire for them. But I know this company very, very well. I've done some work with them in the past, and it wasn't a good experience. And I just know from other folks in the local community that they don't have the greatest employment brand. They don't treat their employees super well, and it's just not the best. I said, so I realized that this is taking on that business would go against our value system and our kind of the core to who we are. But at the same time, we need the revenue. And without that revenue, we have to decide who we're going to lay off because we can't keep the whole team together. And I can't remember exactly their expressions, but I probably blacked out at that point after
I can picture
I posed this horrible thing. And it's funny. I don't think I thought of it at the time as being, a quote unquote pitch, but it was really more of a, hey, let's all band together. Let's collaborate. Let's, brainstorm, whatever, phrase you want to use. Let's figure out, how do we get through this? What are some things that we can do? And like I said before, in my mind, the only 2 options were take on the bad business, but at least get the revenue and not lay somebody off, or turn away the bad business, but have to lay somebody off. Those were the kind of the binary, options in my mind at the time. And the amazing thing that's just so incredibly humbling was they came back and they asked me a bunch of questions about the pipeline and business and this potential client and what the roles were and where I thought things were going to be revenue wise in a few months. And I went through that detail with them. And then they came back and said, you know what, Ken, we don't want to lay somebody off, right? Our team is so strong, and we know that we are strong because of the team that we've amassed over these years. But we also really don't want to compromise our core values. It just does not make sense. And based on what you described, this client is not going to be good for us in the long term. And we might get revenue, but it's going to be a huge headache. So let's not go that route. So my thought is, okay, great. Well, I know those are the options. Now what do we do? I'm not bringing this to you guys to just repeat to me what the options are.
Yeah.
But then they came back and said, so what we want to do is this is collectively, the four of them, we are willing to forego our salary, our compensation for the next 3 months, which is, again, as just kind of floored me that they would say this. We'll forego our salaries so that we, A, don't have to take on bad business, and B, so we don't lose one of our team members. And, we're confident in you that you'll get us back on track, right? No pressure, right?
No, not at all.
I've always been the only person that is in the BD role for the firm. Nobody else brings in business. It's really just me. And we're willing to do that, they said, for the next few months, and then let's regroup and see where things are. And I also can't remember exactly how I reacted, but I can imagine I was probably just flabbergasted, right? And just, taken back and just in awe that they'd be willing to sacrifice their own compensation for the sake of the team and for the sake of maintaining our core values.
Did they come back with that in that meeting, or did you kind of share the information? Was it at that same time that they came back with that option?
No, it was over the course of the next couple of days. It wasn't. Okay. It wasn't immediate. It was, let's kind of think about what we can do, what the options might be, and come back. But it wasn't that long. I mean, it wasn't like it was a week or at all. It was maybe 1 or 2 days at most.
Yeah.
And I talked to each person individually. We didn't come back together as a team. I think they probably spoke to each other on their own, and then they came back to me kind of individually. And again, I was fortunate that my team, they all had spouses that were in very stable industries with very stable salaries as well. And they're all, in the recruiting world, you learn very quickly that you can't go on a crazy spending, spree when things go well, because you never know when things might change. So they all, kind of run their fiscal households pretty conservatively, which was great. But then, so they came back and made that offer, and I was just so taken aback by their willingness to sacrifice that it was very, very humbling.
Well, and their commitment to the core values. I mean, for sure, the sacrifice, but also them not taking, not the easy way out, but the perceived oh, that's the Band-Aid. We can just use that, even though it's not a total fix and it's not aligned. Right. I think that speaks volumes to the type of company that you run and the type of team that you do have. That one, they know the core values, right. So they know when something feels out of alignment, and that they are willing to pitch in together to kind of do it for the team. And it's interesting you said you don't see it as a pitch, and I don't think I typically would have either, but I think the business that we're in, I start to see almost everything as a pitch being, I have an idea, or I have a problem, or I think we should collaborate. And that's kind of what I'm seeing as the theme through this is your willingness to be vulnerable and offer up really where you are. And then their vulnerability also in collaborating and coming up with a solution together.
Yeah, no, I agree. And thank you. I appreciate that. And I think, the framing it as a pitch, I think, thanks to you, I think about it that way now as well. And I think, with every pitch, with every proposal, whatever you want to call it, you have to have your research, as you mentioned earlier. What did I do kind of beforehand? It's not just a knee-jerk reaction or an emotional reaction to a bad situation. You really have to know your stuff going into that. And that's where I think also I've always challenged my team. I think, all the leaders that I aspire to be like have kind of taught me that through reading or what have you, that, you don't want to have a team that just brings up problems. And you as a leader don't want to just bring up problems either. It's got to be solution oriented, right? Here's the issue. Here's the challenge. Here's what's going on. But here's how I think we should attack it. And at least that's a good starting point. It shows, if you're the employee coming to your leader with a problem, it shows your leader that you've been thinking through this, that you're not just saying, hey, Mr. Mrs. Leader, here's the problem, solve it for me. Instead, it's here's the issue. Let's work together to figure out how we can resolve it and push through. And so I think that kind of research before the pitch, if you will, but also having some options ready to go and potential solutions. That's what makes for great leaders, but also makes for a strong team.
For sure. We're working through now really identifying our core values. And one of them is being an innovative solutions finder. Mm-hmm. And that's everyone on the team, not just us collectively, but individually when things pop up. Like, let's bring an idea, because it's so much easier to brainstorm from an idea than just a blank slate and a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, and so it was great. It was a good experience, and it was like I said, very humbling. But and I think who would have thought that level of adversity would have been an opportunity to strengthen our bond and strengthen our team, kind of our leadership, but also our team kind of cohesiveness. But it really did. I mean, it really, kind of solidified the fact that we are a family and we're all in this together.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it also invigorated you as the leader. Just seeing the commitment your team had, it probably motivated you to get out there and get that business in a way that you may not have. I mean, not that you wouldn't have before, but I can imagine being more driven because you're developing the business for the team as well. So how did it end up? Like, what happened in 3 months? Did we pay them?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm happy to say that it was a very positive result. So 3 months, actually about 2 or so months later, things started to improve. And 3 months later, things were, back to normal, which is great. So 3 months later, I was able to pay them the money that they had forfeited over the previous 3 months. So that was great. So we were back on track. And then 3 months after that, things had improved so much that I was still able to pay them small bonuses, kind of year-end bonuses at the very end of 2015. So yeah, so it was a tumultuous year to say the least, but it was a very positive result. And then 2016, the year following, ended up being a record year for us. It was the first year that we hit $1 million in revenue. So in a 12-month span, it went from the worst possible situation to a record-setting year.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. That's such a great story. Any takeaways from that we haven't touched on?
That's a good question. I think for anybody that hears about transparency, I think many times people think it's all or nothing, that you have to share every single thing about what's going on or you share nothing. And that's really not the reality. Like most things in life, there's not two extremes. There's a lot in the middle that makes more sense. And I think, someone that's trying to maybe start to build up their leadership style in a more transparent way, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. Right. And you don't want to, overburden your team also with so much information that all of a sudden they're thinking, what is going on? Why is Ken all of a sudden dumping all this data on us that we didn't even ask for? Right.
Yeah.
And so it's got to be gradual. It's got to be a little bit of a give and take. And you have to, I think, really kind of lay the groundwork and explain the fact that, hey, I want to empower you as my team. I want to allow you to do the work that I hired you to do, but I also want to give you some exposure to what's happening in terms of the overall running of the business. Yes, you might be a warehouse manager right now. You might be an accounting manager. You might be, an HR business partner right now. But I'm hoping that your goal is to move into leadership long term, ideally with my company, but maybe somewhere else. And in order to help kind of equip you with that ability, with that business acumen, I'm going to share some information that's beyond the scope of your job description. And I want you to ask questions because I want you to understand what it takes to actually run a business. And that's where I think kind of for me, the takeaway is it doesn't happen overnight, and you have to lay the groundwork and build that foundation over time so that when you do have this kind of a really difficult situation that you're encountering, then you already have that rapport and that trust built in.
I love that because as I grow in leadership, one of the hardest parts for me is to figure out how much to share, like the balance, like you said, without overwhelming. But that the phrase that you used, telling them like, I'm going to share this with you and I want you to ask questions, I think really invites them into the conversation in a way that they feel included and they feel empowered to kind of participate rather than it being like, here's our State of the Union address. Now go on. I really like that it is a community and a collaborative feel.
Definitely.
a little bit off tangent, but are there any resources that you recommend when talking or that were helpful to you as a leader in transparency and some of the communication pieces?
That's a good question. I'm a voracious reader. I spend all day on my computer. So when I do read, I actually read a physical book, or I read the
Yes.
physical Wall Street Journal, which is kind of strange. I think I'm the only driveway in my who actually has a newspaper on it every morning.
The driver hates you. He's
Yeah, exactly
like-
right. Well, this one house I have to go to every time. But yeah, so I read a lot, and I try to get different perspectives. I don't know if I can speak to one particular. There's a book I read recently by Hubert Jolly, who was the CEO, the turnaround CEO at Best Buy. And he had been at Carlson Wagon Lit, the big travel agency before that, and had been I think at McKinsey prior to that. And his whole focus is around vulnerability. And you don't hear that very often from a CEO at that level with that stature at that size company. But he talks a lot about when he came into Best Buy and the fact that, going into the different showrooms, the different stores, and people just didn't care. People wouldn't come up and talk to him. He was kind of doing like a secret shopper kind of thing. And I think, you've got to be aware of what's happening with your business. And I think he does a really good job of talking about vulnerability and sharing and how that really allowed him to turn the business around in a very difficult time for the organization. So that was very good. There's always the book, The E-Myth, which I've read a couple of times by Michael Garber, who actually is a San Diego resident as well. Nice. But that's a really good book for small business owners or startup founders in terms of focusing on, kind of running the business strategically versus just being in the business. Yeah. And I think, owners and of small business especially, they get so caught up in being in the business that they don't want to share. And they just play things so close to the vest. They feel like I have to be the one to own and touch and control everything. And so their team is really left, not being able to do much to contribute. So those are a couple books that come to mind for sure.
Okay. Awesome. Super helpful. Well, I appreciate you sharing this story. I think the audience is really going to appreciate the vulnerability. And I think that's going to be the takeaway from this episode is like when you're pitching, the collaboration, the vulnerability can really help the other person feel compelled to participate. We've had times when we pitch clients to be a guest on someone's show and it might not work straight away, but then there's a little bit of negotiating back and forth or tweaking the concept or the topic. So I love this. I think it will be super helpful for listeners.
Yeah, and the last thing I would share also is just, everybody I talk to on the recruiting side is obviously what we do. There's such a challenge or this perceived challenge of managing, Gen Z and even younger millennials compared to like me, Gen X, and then baby boomers, right? And one of the hallmarks of the Gen Z world of that whole cohort is transparency, but also they want to know that what they're doing in their job, whatever the job is, what they're doing, how is it contributing and impacting the business? And I think, in my experience, this transparency is a very simple, very easy way to do it. Doesn't cost you any money. It just costs you your time, right? And that willingness to be vulnerable. But that's a great way to keep them engaged, to retain those employees also, to say, hey, you're doing this job in the warehouse or wherever, but here's how it impacts the bigger business. And I want to bring you into those bigger business conversations. And everybody appreciates that, but especially, Gen Z, they really appreciate that.
Okay. Yeah, that's really great to know. If folks want to connect with you after this, where's the best place?
Yeah, LinkedIn is really kind of where I eat, breathe, and sleep all day long is LinkedIn. So I'm
You're a
there,
celebrity over there, Ken.
Thanks. in my small little world, yes.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, I think so.
And LinkedIn is great because it's not Facebook. It's not, here's a picture of me and my dog, right? Mm-hmm. Although I will say, if you are on LinkedIn and you share a picture of you and your dog and you find a way to connect it to your business, that's a great thing to do. But LinkedIn is a great platform. We have, so Turning Point Executive Search is the firm. We have a Turning Point Connections group and company page. I'm on there as well as Ken Schmitt. And that's a great place to connect. And then I have a podcast as well, which is called Leadership Happens. And we're on all the major platforms out there. And then I published a book earlier this year called The Practical Optimist. And that's also available out there. And I talk a lot about transparency and kind of building your core values within the book also.
Yeah, perfect. Well, listeners, go connect with Ken. He's got a great newsletter on LinkedIn as well. I just saw your most recent article. Super, super interesting. What was the title of it?
Weed at Work.
Yeah. So go read it. It was really intriguing. Ken, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was great being here.
You know, what I loved most during this interview was when Ken mentioned that he didn't think of sharing what was going on with the business with his team as a pitch. It shows to me how normal this type of discussion and transparency is for him and his team, really. And that's the takeaway here. It was that transparency, that restrained vulnerability, right? You don't have to lay all the dirty details on the table. And his openness that allowed the team to create a solution that he had never even considered. I see this a lot in the work that we do for our clients. Sometimes when we pitch a topic to a host, we get a reply of, oh, that's not a right fit, or, oh, we have a media fee, or something else that may otherwise seemingly shut down the conversation. But when we reply back with transparency and offer a solution, maybe another topic idea, an interview swap, or something else that we think of that's specific to that host and their needs, we can often work out a solution that meets both of our goals. And candidly, a lot of times that allows us to develop an even deeper relationship with that host moving forward. So think about that as you go into this week. Whoever and whatever you might be pitching, can you be transparent and vulnerable enough that the other party will view you as human and reply back? Maybe not with an immediate yes, but at least with a response that keeps the door open and the conversation flowing. I hope so, and I would love to hear about it. If you found this episode to be helpful, please go out and share it with a friend. As we have shifted the content and the title and all of that stuff, I would really love to connect with listeners who find this type of content valuable. So I know that many of you did after our first new pitched episode with Kristen Carbone, and I so appreciate you sharing the love of what we are doing here. And as always, if you have not connected with me on LinkedIn, please do that. Shoot me a connection request. Let me know that you're a podcast listener, and let's get that conversation started. Okay, friend, until next time, be well and get pitched. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pitched. If you would love to get pitched to be a guest on podcasts, we here at the Podwize Group would love to help you. We offer 2 primary services to support our clients in landing and converting podcast interviews. Whether you want to handle the pitching yourself or you'd like our team to do it all, hop on over to our site, thepodwizegroup.com/services to check out how we can help. If one of them suits your fancy, you can schedule a time to connect with me right there. I am so looking forward to connecting with you.